11 years ago, my husband emptied our joint bank accounts and abandoned me with his nonverbal autistic daughter so he could run off with his mistress. We were left drowning in a sea of medical debt and eviction notices. Today, that same little girl is 15 years old and a secret prodigy in the contemporary art world. When her latest masterpiece sold at an exclusive Buckhead gallery for $3.8 million, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP room burst open. My ex-husband marched in with a slick lawyer and a court order demanding control of every single penny. I looked at my attorney and told him to let the man have it. But my daughter calmly reached for her communication device, typed a few words, and let the robotic voice echo through the room. "Leave this to me." Before I tell you exactly how we dismantled his entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build an empire from the ashes someone else left behind. The air inside the prestigious Buckhead Art Gallery in Atlanta was thick with the scent of expensive cedar and aged leather. It was the kind of room where people whispered instead of talked, and where a casual nod from a collector could move millions of dollars across international borders. I stood near the back of the private viewing room, keeping a careful distance from the crowd of wealthy socialites and aggressive investors. Beside me sat my 15-year-old daughter Maya. She had her noise-canceling headphones firmly over her ears to block out the overwhelming hum of the crowd. Her eyes were locked on her digital drawing tablet. Her fingers moved in rapid, precise strokes, completely detached from the high-stakes financial war happening just 10 feet away from us. The auctioneer, a tall man with a crisp, authoritative voice, stood at the podium. To his right rested the absolute centerpiece of the evening. It was a massive canvas titled "The Silence of Chaos." It was a breathtaking explosion of deep crimsons, fractured geometric shadows, and stark white voids that seemed to pull the viewer directly into the mind of the artist. Nobody in this room knew the artist personally. They only knew the highly guarded pseudonym NM. They did not know that NM stood for Naomi and Maya. They certainly did not know that the brilliant mind behind those chaotic, beautiful strokes belonged to the neurodivergent teenager, rocking gently in the quietest corner of the room. The bidding had started at a modest $500,000, but it escalated with terrifying speed. Two rival collectors from New York and Chicago were locked in a vicious bidding war. I placed a protective hand on Maya's shoulder. She leaned into my touch, never breaking her focus from her screen. I could feel my own heart hammering violently against my ribs. $3 million, the auctioneer announced, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs of the room. Do I hear 3.2? A paddle went up near the front row. 3.2 million. Then another paddle went up in the back. 3.5. The numbers were staggering. This was not just money to me. This was freedom. This was the ultimate security I had promised Maya when we were sleeping on a deflating air mattress a decade ago, eating generic brand cereal and praying the electricity would not be shut off. $3.8 million. The auctioneer called out, scanning the room with sharp eyes. Going once, going twice. The heavy wooden gavel came down with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed off the high gallery walls. Sold for $3.8 million to the gentleman in the back. A wave of polite, sophisticated applause rippled through the room. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding for the last 10 minutes. I squeezed Maya's shoulder and leaned down to whisper that we did it. We were finally safe. But before the echo of the applause could even fade, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite crashed open with a violent thud. The harsh noise made several wealthy collectors jump in their seats. Maya flinched violently at the sudden disruption, her hands flying up to press her headphones tighter against her ears. She began to rock back and forth at a faster pace, a clear sign of rising anxiety. I instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her from whatever was happening at the entrance. A man strode into the room, carrying himself with a foul sense of unearned ownership. He was wearing a flashy tailored suit that screamed new money and desperation. A heavy gold watch caught the gallery lights as he swung his arms. It took my brain a fraction of a second to process the face I was looking at. It was Marcus, my ex-husband, the man who had walked out of our lives 11 years ago without so much as a backward glance. I was not alone. Flanking him was a sharp-looking white man, carrying a thick leather briefcase. The lawyer had the cold, calculating eyes of a predator who smelled blood in the water. Marcus did not even look at the spectacular painting that had just sold for millions. He did not look at the wealthy collectors who were now staring at him in absolute outrage for ruining the prestige of the event. His eyes locked directly onto me. "Naomi, what a pleasant surprise," Marcus said, his voice dripping with mock warmth and heavy sarcasm. He walked right past the gallery director, who was demanding he leave the premises immediately. Marcus slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the central glass table. The heavy thud made Maya whimper behind me. I kept my body firmly positioned between them, planting my feet into the hardwood floor. "Freeze the accounts immediately," Marcus announced, his voice booming through the silent room. He pointed an aggressive finger at the gallery director. "Do not transfer a single dime to her. As the biological father and legal guardian of the artist, I am taking immediate control of these funds." The gallery director looked at me in absolute shock. The room fell into a dead, uncomfortable silence. I kept my face perfectly neutral. Years of negotiating in the cutthroat underground art world had taught me never to show panic when a predator was testing your defenses. I slowly stepped forward, making sure Maya was completely blocked from his line of sight. "You are trespassing, Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "You need to leave before I have security drag you out by that cheap lapel." Marcus laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made my skin crawl. He leaned over the glass table, looking at me with absolute contempt. "Security is not going to touch me, Naomi. I have a federal court order right here." He tapped the documents aggressively. "I heard my little girl is a genius, making millions in the art world. You really thought you could hide this kind of money from her real family? You are just a stepmother, Naomi. You have absolutely no legal standing here. So step aside and let me take care of my daughter's finances." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the stale air of the gallery. The wealthy patrons were watching us like it was a television drama. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my voice to save him from embarrassment. I took a step closer to him, invading his personal space until he was forced to lean back slightly. "Your daughter." I repeated the words, tasting like poison in my mouth. "You remember you have a daughter after 11 years of dead silence. Where was this fatherly devotion when she was 4 years old and screaming in the middle of the night because she did not understand why her dad never came home? Where was this protective guardian when the children's hospital was threatening to cut off her vital speech therapy because her insurance had lapsed?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He tried to speak, but I cut him off, stepping even closer. My voice was lethal, sharp, and entirely under control. "Do not play the loving father in front of these people, Marcus. I know exactly who you are. You drained our joint bank accounts down to the last 42 cents. You took the money we had meticulously saved for her medical bills to fund a luxury apartment for your mistress in Miami. You left me with a nonverbal autistic child, an eviction notice, and a mountain of crushing debt. You do not get to claim the harvest when you abandon the soil to rot." A few shocked gasps echoed from the gallery patrons. The gallery director was already dialing his phone, likely calling security or the police to intervene. Marcus's face flushed with deep anger and profound embarrassment. His mask of the wealthy, successful businessman was slipping rapidly, revealing the desperate, greedy coward underneath. "You listen to me, you arrogant witch!" Marcus snarled, dropping the polite act entirely. "That is my blood sitting in that corner. That money belongs to the Caldwell family. You are nothing but a glorified babysitter who got lucky. I am taking what is mine." I took a sudden step toward Maya, trying to bypass me. My arm shot out, pressing hard against his chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. "If you take one more step toward her, I will break your jaw," I promised him, making sure he saw the absolute terrifying certainty in my eyes. "I am not the scared 25-year-old girl you left behind, Marcus. You will not touch her." Before Marcus could push back, his lawyer stepped smoothly between us. The lawyer adjusted his tie and offered a chilling, highly professional smile. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for me to see clearly. "Mrs. Jenkins," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and incredibly condescending. "My name is David Sterling. I represent Mr. Caldwell. While your emotional attachment to the child is certainly touching, the law does not operate on feelings. It operates on strict documentation. I stared at the paper in his hand. It bore the official authentic seal of the Fulton County Family Court. You see, Mrs. Jenkins, the lawyer continued loudly enough for the entire room of investors to hear. When Maya's biological mother passed away shortly after birth, she never formally revoked Mr. Caldwell's parental rights. And according to the state of Georgia, your official adoption of Maya was never finalized. You are legally nothing to this child but a former stepmother. My blood ran cold. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I knew exactly why the adoption was never finalized. 10 years ago, I had scraped together every single dollar I had to hire a reputable adoption attorney to make Maya officially mine. But Marcus had intercepted the mail, stolen the cashier's check, and used the funds to cover his own personal gambling debts before vanishing completely. Because of his calculated theft, the paperwork was abandoned. I had spent the next decade working 80-hour weeks just to keep a roof over our heads and pay for Maya's specialized daily care. We lived as mother and daughter in every way that mattered, but that final piece of paper was missing. Because you are not her legal adoptive mother, you have no authority over her estate. The lawyer stated, his smile widening into a predatory grin. As of 9 o'clock this morning, a judge granted Mr. Caldwell an emergency injunction. He is now the temporary conservator of Maya's entire financial portfolio. The $3.8 million from this auction is officially frozen, and by tomorrow morning it will be transferred into a trust controlled entirely by my client. Marcus smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked past me toward Maya, who was still rocking in the corner, her eyes tightly shut against the overwhelming situation. "Pack your bags, Naomi," Marcus said, his voice dripping with toxic victory. "I am coming to pick her up tomorrow. You are out." I stood frozen in the center of the opulent room, surrounded by millions of dollars of art and the shocked faces of Atlanta's elite. The man who had destroyed my youth and abandoned a helpless child was now standing here, legally empowered to steal the future I had bled to build for her. The heavy mahogany doors remained open, framing the reality of the nightmare that had just walked back into my life. The $3.8 million was frozen, and my daughter was legally in the hands of a monster. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Fulton County Courthouse buzzed relentlessly above my head. The long corridor smelled faintly of cheap floor wax and stale coffee. I sat on a hard wooden bench, staring straight ahead. Maya was safely tucked away at a private therapy center across town. I had made sure she was far away from this toxic environment. I had to face this legal nightmare completely alone, alongside my attorney, David Sterling. David was standing a few feet away, reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs. He was a brilliant man, but even he looked tense this morning. The emergency hearing was scheduled to begin in exactly 10 minutes. The heavy glass doors at the far end of the hallway suddenly swung open. A loud burst of arrogant laughter echoed down the quiet corridor. I did not need to turn my head to know exactly who had just arrived. The overwhelming scent of heavy floral perfume reached me before they did. It was Chloe. My former sister-in-law was strutting down the hallway like she was walking a red carpet. She was dripping in flashy logos and fake designer brands, trying desperately to project an image of extreme wealth. Her tight dress and oversized sunglasses were a pathetic attempt to look like a high society elite. Walking right beside her was her husband, Bradley. He was a middle-aged white man with a red face and a receding hairline. Bradley was a hotshot real estate broker who always carried himself with an insufferable sense of superiority. He wore a loud pinstripe suit that cost more than my first car. He walked with his chest puffed out, swinging an expensive leather briefcase. He always looked down on Marcus, but tolerated him because Marcus knew how to play the obedient sidekick. Now they were all united by one single goal. They wanted to get their hands on my daughter and her $3.8 million trust fund. I kept my posture rigid and my face completely blank. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing any fear in my eyes. As they approached the courtroom doors, Bradley intentionally veered off his path. He stepped directly toward my bench. He did not slow down. He bumped his heavy shoulder hard against mine. It was a deliberate, aggressive move meant to intimidate me. I did not flinch. I slowly stood up and smoothed out the jacket of my tailored suit. Bradley stopped and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the empty hall. He said I was still wearing that cheap public school teacher suit and told me to stop trying to leech off that kid. I stared directly into his pale, watery eyes. I felt a surge of cold fury building in my chest, but I kept my breathing perfectly even. I remembered this man very clearly. I remembered a freezing night 10 years ago when Maya was incredibly sick. Her specialized autism therapy and her medications had drained every single penny I had. The eviction notice was taped to my apartment door. I was desperate and terrified for my little girl. I had swallowed every ounce of my pride and gone to Bradley and Chloe to beg for a simple $2,000 loan. I remembered standing on their pristine porch in the pouring rain. I remembered the way Bradley had looked at me with pure contempt while Chloe sipped wine in the background. Bradley had laughed in my face that night. He told me that I was a fool for taking on another man's defective burden. He told me that I should just dump Maya in a state-run orphanage and move on with my life. He said he would not waste a single dime on a disabled child who would never amount to anything. Now this same man was standing in a courthouse hallway, desperately trying to steal the millions of dollars that very same disabled child had earned through her own sheer genius. Bradley sneered, leaning closer so I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He told me I should have listened to him 10 years ago and dumped her when I had the chance. He said they were going to take everything, and I was going to walk away with nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I looked at Bradley with a calmness that clearly unsettled him. I told him quietly that the only thing he was going to take away from this was a lesson in humility. I told him he thought he was standing on top of the world right now, but the ground beneath his feet was completely hollow. Chloe rolled her eyes and grabbed Bradley's arm. She told him not to waste his breath on me, shooting me a venomous glare. She called me a bitter, broke loser who got caught trying to steal from their family. She said Marcus was getting his daughter back today, and they were going to make sure I never saw Maya again. David Sterling stepped forward, positioning himself smoothly between me and my hostile former-in-laws. He adjusted his glasses and gave Bradley a polite but freezing smile. David professionally suggested they save their colorful commentary for the judge, adding that harassing his client in the hallway was not going to help their incredibly flawed case. Bradley scoffed and adjusted his expensive tie. He muttered that they did not need any help taking down a couple of desperate frauds. He wrapped his arm around Chloe, and they strutted through the heavy oak doors into the courtroom. Marcus was already inside, sitting at the plaintiff's table with his high-priced attorney. I took a deep breath and followed David inside. The courtroom was cold and imposing. The wood paneling and the high ceilings were designed to make you feel small. We took our seats at the defense table. Marcus did not even look at me. He was busy whispering to his lawyer, looking incredibly smug and relaxed. He was acting like a man who had already won the lottery. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. We all stood as a stern-looking older man took his seat behind the high bench. I knew right away that we were in trouble. This particular judge had a reputation for favoring strict biological rights over actual caregiving history. Marcus and his expensive lawyer had clearly shopped around to get their emergency injunction in front of this specific judge. The proceedings began with Marcus's lawyer painting a tragic picture of a heartbroken father. He claimed that Marcus had been searching for his daughter for over a decade. He claimed that I had maliciously hidden Maya away, moving from apartment to apartment, to keep her biological father out of her life. It was a complete fabrication. I had lived in the exact same zip code for 11 years. Marcus had simply never bothered to look because he was too busy spending all his money on his mistresses and failed business ventures. But the real performance began when Chloe took the witness stand. She walked up to the box, clutching a designer tissue, looking like a grieving aunt. She swore to tell the truth, and then proceeded to commit the most blatant and disgusting perjury I had ever witnessed in my life. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut and forced out a few fake tears. She told the judge that she and Marcus had been crying themselves to sleep every night worrying about Maya. She claimed that they had hired private investigators, but I had somehow managed to evade them all. Then she launched into her most vicious attack. She sobbed and wiped her dry eyes, begging the judge to save her niece. She declared that I was not a mother, but a monster. She testified that I ran a sweatshop in my basement, locking a poor disabled child in a dark room and forcing her to paint day and night. She lied to the court saying, I did not let Maya play or go outside, and that I used her autism to manipulate her into creating art for profit. She painted me as a greedy, abusive woman who was exploiting a helpless child. I felt my fingernails digging deeply into the palms of my hands. My blood was boiling with a rage so intense it threatened to consume me. Maya loved painting more than anything in the world. It was her voice. It was her escape. Art therapy had saved her life when she was struggling with severe sensory overloads. I had spent countless hours sitting patiently beside her, buying her the best canvases and paints blending colors to help her express the beautiful, chaotic world inside her mind. I had never forced her to do anything. I had protected her peace with my life. David stood up and objected fiercely to Chloe's baseless claims. He demanded that they provide a single shred of evidence to support these horrific allegations. But Marcus's lawyer smoothly pivoted back to the legal technicalities. The slick lawyer paced confidently in front of the bench, stating that the allegations of abuse would be investigated in due time. He argued that the core issue today was legal standing. He hammered home the point that I was not the adoptive mother of the child and had zero legal rights. He presented Marcus as the sole surviving biological parent, claiming he was a successful businessman who was more than capable of providing a stable, loving home for his daughter. He respectfully requested the court grant Marcus immediate temporary conservatorship over Maya and her financial assets to protect her from further exploitation. David presented my side with brilliant logic. He submitted hundreds of pages of medical records, therapy bills, and school reports showing that I was the sole provider for Maya for 11 years. He pointed out that Marcus had not paid a single dime in child support since the day he left. He showed the court that Marcus had actively stolen the adoption funds a decade ago, which was the only reason the paperwork was never finalized. But the judge was not looking at the 11 years of love and sacrifice. He was looking at the cold, hard letters of the law. He looked at the missing signature on an adoption decree. He looked at the biological father who had hired a very persuasive lawyer to exploit a massive legal loophole. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge reviewed the final documents. I looked over at Marcus. I was practically vibrating with greed. He did not care about Maya. He cared about the $3.8 million sitting in that frozen gallery account. He cared about the future paintings she could produce. He viewed my daughter as nothing more than a highly lucrative asset that he could finally cash in. The judge finally spoke, his voice echoing harshly through the room. He stated he had reviewed the emergency petition and the presented evidence. He acknowledged that I had provided significant care for the minor child. However, he declared the law regarding biological parental rights to be absolute. He ruled that Marcus had demonstrated he was the biological father, and the legal rights of the deceased mother were never formally terminated. Furthermore, the court found the sudden generation of massive financial assets by a vulnerable minor to require immediate and strict oversight by a recognized legal guardian. I felt my stomach drop completely out of my body. I knew what was coming next, but hearing the words spoken out loud felt like a physical blow to the chest. The judge struck his gavel and granted the emergency injunction. He ruled that Marcus Caldwell was thereby granted temporary conservatorship over the minor child Maya and full temporary control over her financial estate, pending a full investigation. He ordered that the funds currently held in escrow by the Buckhead Gallery remain frozen until Marcus established the appropriate trust accounts under his name. He then adjourned the court. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood sounded like a death sentence. The victory on the other side of the room was immediate and sickening. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief and hugged Bradley. Bradley pumped his fist and grinned at me like he had just won a championship game. Marcus stood up slowly, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with a look of absolute triumph on his face. David put a steady hand on my shoulder, trying to keep me grounded. He whispered that we would file an immediate appeal and that this was only a temporary setback. But I was not listening to David. I was watching Marcus walk deliberately around the tables toward me. He did not look like a father who had just won his child back. He looked like a conqueror who had just claimed a massive bounty. He stopped right in front of our table, resting his hands casually on the wood. He leaned over, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. I could smell the expensive cologne he had bought with money he probably borrowed from his arrogant brother-in-law. Marcus smiled, a slow, cruel twisting of his lips. His eyes were completely devoid of any human empathy. He was basking in the absolute destruction of my life. He whispered so low that only I could hear him telling me he was taking what was his. He said he was picking her up this afternoon and commanded me to have her things packed and waiting by the door. He warned me not to make him call the police to drag her out of my pathetic little house. He said I played a good game, but I was entirely out of my league. He told me to pack my bags because I was a loser and I was officially done. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The courtroom began to empty as the bailiff directed people toward the exits. Chloe and Bradley were already waiting by the heavy double doors, laughing together and pointing in my direction. They were reveling in my defeat, enjoying every second of the pain they assumed I was feeling. They thought they had finally put me back in my place. They thought the poor, desperate woman who begged for a loan a decade ago was broken beyond repair. Marcus stood up straight, giving his suit jacket one final arrogant tug. He did not even wait for my response before turning his back on me and walking away to join his sister and her husband. They celebrated in the hallway, their voices echoing off the marble floors as they discussed which expensive restaurants they were going to visit to celebrate their massive legal victory. They were already spending Maya's money in their heads, completely oblivious to the reality of the girl they had just legally kidnapped. David began packing his legal briefs into his leather briefcase, his movements sharp and frustrated. He apologized repeatedly, promising me that he would spend the entire night drafting the appeal to block the transfer of custody. He told me we had options, and that we could demand psychological evaluations and court-appointed guardians to delay Marcus from taking her away. I slowly stood up from the defense table. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was completely clear. I looked at the empty judge's bench and then at the doors where Marcus had just disappeared. The fear and the panic that had gripped my chest only moments ago suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They had wanted a victim, but they had just declared war on a woman who had spent the last 11 years learning how to survive in the dark. I turned to David and told him not to file the appeal. I told him to let Marcus come to the house this afternoon and take her. David looked at me as if I had lost my mind, but I simply picked up my bag and smoothed my tailored suit one last time. They wanted to take control of the assets, and I was going to let them walk right into the trap. I drove straight back from the courthouse to our modest 3-bedroom house on the quiet outskirts of Atlanta. It was a peaceful neighborhood filled with working-class families, completely hidden away from the flashy mansions and toxic vanity of Buckhead. This house was our absolute sanctuary. I had spent a decade making sure every single corner of it was perfectly tailored to the sensory needs of my daughter. Soft ambient lighting lined the hallways to prevent visual overload. Soundproof padding heavily insulated her art studio so she could paint without the distraction of street noise. It was a safe space built entirely on unconditional love and grueling hard work. But as I pulled into the driveway, I knew that our safety was about to be violently breached. Less than 2 hours later, heavy fists began pounding aggressively on my front door. I did not even have time to turn the deadbolt before the door was shoved open with brutal force. Marcus marched into my home as if he owned the very air inside it. Right behind him were Chloe and Bradley, looking around my modest living room with sneers of absolute disgust. They had brought 2 burly private security guards and a court-appointed official just to enforce the emergency conservatorship order. They wanted to make a spectacle out of my defeat. Marcus did not wait for an invitation or offer a single word of greeting. He walked straight past me and began opening cabinets, throwing my personal belongings onto the floor as he searched for anything valuable. Chloe followed closely behind him, running her heavily manicured fingers over my inexpensive furniture and laughing under her breath. She loudly complained about the cheap decor and told Bradley they would need to fumigate the entire place before they could put it on the market. Bradley ignored her completely. He immediately headed down the hallway toward the back of the house where Maya had her private art studio. I followed them, keeping my breathing incredibly slow and measured. When I reached the studio door, my stomach turned violently. Bradley was picking up Maya's unfinished canvases, examining the raw, brilliant brushstrokes with pure greed shining in his pale, watery eyes. He was already calculating exactly how much he could sell her half-finished thoughts to his wealthy real estate clients. Marcus walked into the room right behind him and scoffed at the paint-splattered hardwood floors, calling the room a chaotic mess that needed to be gutted. Maya was sitting at the corner of the room, clutching her heavy weighted blanket to her chest. She was terrified by the sudden influx of loud, aggressive strangers invading her quiet sanctuary. She rocked back and forth, letting out a low, distressing hum that tore at my heart. Marcus looked down at his own biological daughter with an expression of complete revulsion. He told Bradley to grab all the finished canvases and load them directly into their luxury vehicle. When Maya let out a louder cry of distress, Marcus completely snapped. He stepped forward and viciously kicked over her sensory light tower. The tall glass cylinder shattered across the floor, scattering colored water and plastic fish everywhere. He pointed a sharp finger at the trembling girl and loudly declared that he was sick of listening to a useless, disabled burden. He said she was finally worth a damn after all these years, and she was going to earn her keep whether she liked it or not. He ordered me to get her out of his sight before he lost his temper and did something we would all regret. I felt a violent primal urge to grab the heavy metal painting easel and swing it directly at his head. The protective mother inside me was screaming for blood. But the strategic businesswoman inside me, the woman who had survived 11 years in the darkest shadows of the city, held me completely still. I knew exactly how these people operated. I knew that if I engaged in a physical altercation or showed any sign of hysterical emotional resistance, they would use it to have me arrested and take Maya away from me permanently. They wanted me to act like a crazy, desperate woman so they could justify their legal theft, instead of screaming or fighting. I slowly walked over to the broken glass. I crouched down beside Maya, ignoring the water soaking into my tailored pants, and gently took her trembling hands. I pulled her augmentative and alternative communication device from her lap. I typed a quick private message, and the robotic voice quietly assured her that everything was going exactly according to plan and that we were simply going on a small adventure. Maya looked deeply into my eyes and saw the absolute calm in my expression. Her anxious rocking slowly began to subside because she trusted me more than she feared them. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet, ignoring Chloe, who was loudly mocking my clothes. I pulled out a single medium-sized suitcase. I did not pack our furniture or our electronics or any of the household items I had spent years paying off. I packed Maya's favorite sensory toys, her specialized daily medications, a few changes of comfortable clothes, and her digital drawing tablet. I packed exactly enough for a temporary stay. Marcus watched me zip the suitcase with a look of deep confusion masking his arrogant face. He had expected me to drop to my knees and beg for mercy. He had wanted a massive screaming match. He wanted the satisfaction of watching me break down into a puddle of tears as he tore my life apart. But I was actively denying him that pleasure. He leaned against the doorframe, trying to provoke me. He called me a coward for giving up so easily. He laughed and told Chloe that I was exactly the pathetic, weak woman he had left behind 11 years ago. He said I did not even have the spine to fight for the house I lived in, and that I deserved to be thrown out on the street. I picked up the suitcase and held Maya's hand securely in mine. I walked right up to Marcus, stopping just inches away from his face. I did not yell. I did not cry. I looked at him and gave him a dead, chilling smile that did not reach my eyes. It was a smile completely devoid of any warmth or fear. I told him he could have the house and everything inside it. I told him to enjoy his new kingdom while it lasted. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine unease pass behind his eyes. My total lack of resistance was unnatural, and his survival instincts briefly warned him that something was terribly wrong. But his bottomless arrogance quickly swallowed that fear. He stepped aside and watched as Maya and I walked out the front door, leaving behind the only home she had ever truly known. We did not go to a homeless shelter. We did not go to a cheap motel on the bad side of town. I drove us directly to an unassuming but highly secure rental apartment in a quiet upscale district of Atlanta. I had signed the lease on this secondary property 2 years ago specifically for emergencies just like this. The apartment was completely furnished, professionally cleaned, and entirely off the grid. Marcus and his high-priced lawyers had absolutely no idea this location existed. An hour after we settled into the new space, there was a sharp, urgent knock at the door. I opened it to let in David Sterling, my attorney. He was carrying a thick leather briefcase and looking incredibly stressed. David walked into the small living room and immediately apologized again for the disaster at the courthouse. He said he was preparing a massive legal counterattack to expose Marcus and regain control of the assets before the conservatorship became permanent. I poured David a cup of dark coffee and told him to sit down. I told him we were not going to fight Marcus in family court because family court was rigged to favor biological ties over actual care. I told him we were going to fight Marcus in a completely different arena. We were going to destroy him in the financial sector. David looked at me with deep confusion and a hint of pity. He reminded me that I was a middle school art therapist, and that going up against Bradley, who was a cutthroat real estate broker, and Marcus, who ran a logistics company, was absolute financial suicide. They had millions of dollars in backing, and I was a single mother who just lost her home. That was the exact moment I finally pulled back the curtain. I walked over to a hidden wall safe in his bedroom closet, punched in a complicated security code, and pulled out a heavy black dossier. I brought it out to the living room table and slid it across the glass to David. I told him to open it and look closely at the signatures. David opened the thick folder and began reading the documents inside. His eyes widened in absolute shock. The papers were not teaching certificates or therapy schedules. They were corporate registries, offshore account holdings, and high-level art brokerage contracts. All of them were signed and legally bound by an entity known only as NJ. For 11 years, Marcus and the rest of the world thought I was just a struggling public school teacher trying to make ends meet. They thought I survived by clipping coupons and begging for scraps. But they were entirely wrong. When Marcus abandoned us with a mountain of medical debt, I realized that playing by the normal rules would only result in my daughter starving. So I learned a completely new game. I had started using my deep knowledge of art therapy to identify raw, undervalued talent in the local Atlanta art scene. I began brokering private sales for independent artists, taking a very modest commission. Over the years, my network grew exponentially. I studied high finance, corporate law, and offshore asset management late into the night while Maya slept. I built an entire underground empire bridging the massive gap between wealthy anonymous buyers and reclusive, brilliant artists. In the highly exclusive, fiercely guarded contemporary art world, I was not Naomi, the poor, abandoned stepmother. I was NJ. I was one of the most ruthless and highly respected underground art brokers in the entire Southeast. I knew more about asset protection shell companies and liquidity manipulation than Bradley's entire real estate firm combined. I had spent a decade building a fortress of wealth in the shadows, completely insulated from the arrogant men who thought they ruled the city. David stared at the documents, his hands actually shaking, as he realized the sheer scale of the financial network I independently controlled. He looked up at me completely speechless. He finally understood that the modest woman sitting in front of him was an apex predator dressed in a tailored suit. I sat down across from him and took a slow sip of my coffee. I explained that Marcus and Bradley were completely blinded by their own immense greed. They saw a disabled teenage girl and a $3.8 million price tag, and their brains simply stopped working. They thought they had backed a helpless rabbit into a corner, and they were ready to feast. They did not realize they had just walked straight into a locked cage with a starving lion. I tapped the thick financial dossier on the table with my index finger. I told David to let them think they had won today. I told him to let them take the house and celebrate their victory with expensive champagne. We were going to let them take the bait because greedy men always choke when they try to swallow more than they can chew. I leaned forward and looked David dead in the eyes. I gave him his final instructions. Let them think they have secured the bag, David. Execute Plan B. Trigger the liquidity trap. We are going to let them hang themselves with their own insatiable greed. The very next morning, Marcus strutted into the most exclusive branch of the First Atlanta Heritage Bank, looking like a man who had just conquered the entire city. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored suit that he had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card the night before. Walking right beside him were Chloe and Bradley. They moved together like a pack of starving wolves, completely intoxicated by the scent of fresh blood. The bank branch was a massive building with high vaulted ceilings, polished marble floors, and an intimidating atmosphere designed specifically to cater to the ultra-wealthy elite of Georgia. Marcus did not care about the quiet prestige of the room. He marched directly up to the private wealth management desk, with all the arrogance of a king demanding his tribute. He slammed the heavy stack of temporary conservatorship documents onto the pristine marble counter, making a loud noise that echoed through the quiet lobby. He demanded immediate, unrestricted access to the $3.8 million currently sitting in the Buckhead Gallery escrow account. He leaned over the counter and loudly informed the branch manager that he wanted to initiate an immediate wire transfer to a luxury car dealership because he had his eye on a brand new Porsche. Chloe chimed in right behind him, demanding that a six-figure payout be routed directly to her personal account to compensate for the supposed emotional distress she had suffered over the last 11 years. They were already dividing up my daughter's hard-earned money before the ink on the judge's order was even dry. The branch manager was a stern older man with silver hair who did not look remotely impressed by their loud, obnoxious demands. He calmly adjusted his glasses and spent several minutes carefully reviewing the court orders Marcus had thrown on his desk. The manager finally looked up and informed Marcus that while the temporary conservatorship was indeed legally binding, there was a massive unavoidable roadblock. I explained that due to incredibly strict federal anti-money laundering protocols regarding high-value contemporary art sales, the funds could not be immediately liquidated. The gallery escrow account was legally locked under a mandatory 90-day holding period. This holding period was required by federal law to verify the international buyer's credentials and to clear all necessary federal tax clearances before a single dime could be released. Marcus completely lost his mind. His face turned a deep shade of purple and he slammed his fist hard against the marble counter. He started yelling that it was his money and he wanted it right now. He complained bitterly that he had already promised payouts to his private investors, and he absolutely could not wait 3 months to access the cash. He threatened to sue the bank and called the manager incompetent. Chloe crossed her arms and started loudly complaining that the system was rigged to keep them from enjoying their rightful wealth. She tapped her fake designer heels against the marble floor and whined that she had already scheduled appointments with high-end real estate agents to buy a vacation home. The branch manager remained completely unfazed by the childish temper tantrum happening in his lobby. He calmly typed a few commands into his keyboard and then looked back up at the furious group. He offered them a highly lucrative alternative. He told Marcus that since the $3.8 million asset was fully authenticated and legally under his temporary control, the bank could offer a commercial bridge loan. They could advance Marcus the full amount of the painting immediately in pure liquid cash. But there was a very specific catch. A bridge loan of this staggering magnitude required a verified corporate guarantor. Someone with substantial liquid assets and a registered legitimate business had to sign on the dotted line to back the loan, just in case the federal holding period encountered any unforeseen legal disputes. The manager looked directly at Marcus and noted that his logistics company was currently showing massive deficits, and therefore Marcus could not qualify for the bridge loan on his own. That was the exact moment Bradley stepped forward, his pale, watery eyes gleaming with bottomless, unchecked greed. This was the moment his towering arrogance completely blinded him to reality. Bradley was a hotshot real estate broker who firmly believed he was the smartest and most capable man in any room he walked into. He had always looked down on Marcus, viewing his brother-in-law as a pathetic loser who could never catch a break. But right now, Bradley saw Marcus as a highly useful idiot. He looked down at Marcus with a smirk of absolute superiority, asserting his dominance over the situation. Bradley told Marcus to step aside and let a real businessman handle the complicated financial matters. He slapped his own expensive leather briefcase onto the marble counter and proudly declared that his premier real estate brokerage firm would act as the corporate guarantor for the entire loan. Bradley genuinely thought this was a foolproof master plan. He knew the painting had already sold at a highly publicized auction, so he assumed the money was absolutely guaranteed to clear in 90 days. He figured he could leverage his own company to secure the cash today, and then charge Marcus a massive predatory percentage fee for doing him a favor. He saw it as easy money, and a chance to prove that he was the true financial savior of the family. Chloe squealed with sheer delight, clapping her hands together and praising her husband for being so brilliant and resourceful. She wrapped her arms around his neck and told him he was an absolute genius for outsmarting the federal banking system. The bank manager nodded politely and printed out a massive labyrinth of dense legal paperwork. It was a stack of documents dozens of pages long, filled with incredibly complex financial jargon, offshore tax stipulations, and severe corporate liability clauses. The manager placed a sleek silver pen on top of the stack and formally asked Bradley if he wanted to have his own independent legal counsel review the terms before signing. A smart man would have stopped right there. A smart man would have paid a financial lawyer to read every single line of the fine print before risking his entire livelihood. But Bradley and Marcus were not smart men. They were arrogant, impatient, and completely consumed by the blinding allure of instant unearned wealth. Bradley scoffed at the manager and proudly stated that he navigated complex commercial real estate contracts every single day and did not need a babysitter to hold his hand. He did not even bother to read the documents. He barely glanced at the liability warnings printed in bold letters across the front page. Bradley boldly signed his name across the guarantor lines with a flourish, essentially putting his entire real estate brokerage firm, his personal home, and every single asset he had ever acquired straight onto the chopping block. Marcus eagerly scribbled his signature right next to Bradley's, desperate to get his hands on the cash and prove to the world that he had finally won. He practically shoved the clipboard back toward the bank manager, demanding to know how fast the funds would hit his account. The manager calmly stamped the paperwork and informed them the transfer would be completed within the hour. They walked out of the bank with their heads held high, feeling like absolute kings. They strutted through the revolving glass doors, completely unaware that they had just enthusiastically signed their own financial death warrants. The scene shifts away from their toxic celebration and back to me. I was sitting in the dimly lit home office of our secure off-the-grid rental apartment. Maya was sitting happily on a plush rug just a few feet away from my desk, humming a soft, comforting melody as she played with her new sensory building blocks. The chaotic invasion of our home the day before was already fading from her mind because she felt entirely safe in this new quiet space. I had my laptop open on the heavy wooden desk, staring intently at the highly encrypted financial portal I used to manage my underground art brokerage empire. The dark screen displayed the complex internal banking network that was directly linked to the Buckhead Gallery escrow account. I had worked with David Sterling for months to set up this exact financial architecture. We knew Marcus was drowning in debt, and we knew his desperation would make him sloppy. David had specifically drafted the escrow agreement to trigger the most severe anti-money laundering protocols, knowing it would force a mandatory holding period. We anticipated that Marcus would throw a tantrum and seek a fast cash alternative. The entire situation had been orchestrated with surgical precision to exploit their worst character flaws. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark coffee and watched the progress bar on the screen load with methodical perfection. I had spent years studying the exact mechanisms of high finance and corporate debt structures just to ensure that no one could ever take advantage of my daughter again. I knew exactly how greedy men operated, and I knew exactly what they would do when faced with a minor delay in getting their money. They would always look for a shortcut, and that shortcut was the trapdoor I had carefully hidden beneath their feet. A bright green notification suddenly popped up on my encrypted dashboard, illuminating the dark room. The alert confirmed that a commercial bridge loan of $3.8 million had just been fully executed by the bank. The automated system showed that the documents were officially signed and legally bound without a single amendment or objection. The notification clearly listed Bradley's real estate firm as the primary corporate guarantor and Marcus as the primary debt holder. A cold, deeply satisfying smile spread slowly across my face. The sheer beauty of their ignorance was almost poetic. They thought they had outsmarted a middle school teacher, but they had actually just handed the keys to their entire financial future over to a ghost. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden desk and pushed my office chair back. I leaned over and gently stroked Maya's braided hair, feeling a profound sense of protective victory washing over me. She looked up at me with her bright, curious eyes, tilting her head slightly. I kissed her forehead and whispered softly into the quiet room. The fish just swallowed the hook. The weekend arrived with a heavy, suffocating heat that blanketed the city of Atlanta. Marcus had wasted absolutely no time spending the phantom wealth he thought he had successfully secured. He had rented out the entire main dining room of the most exclusive upscale soul food restaurant in the city. The establishment was famous for its rich history and strictly elite clientele. It was a place where local politicians and wealthy business owners gathered to eat gourmet Southern cuisine while listening to world-class jazz musicians. Tonight, the restaurant was completely closed to the general public. Marcus wanted to make sure every influential person in his network was present to witness his ultimate financial triumph. He was hosting a massive traditional Sunday dinner to publicly flaunt the $3.8 million he believed was sitting safely in his bank account. I spent the entire Sunday morning carefully preparing for the final phase of my plan. I selected a pristine tailored white suit that projected absolute authority and unrelenting power. I wanted to look like an apex predator walking into a room full of unsuspecting prey. I helped Maya dress in her favorite soft cotton clothing, ensuring she was completely comfortable. I placed her noise-canceling headphones over her ears and synced them to a playlist of gentle classical music. She was completely insulated from the chaotic noise of the outside world. I held her hand and promised her that this would be the very last time she ever had to see the people who had hurt us. She gave my hand a firm squeeze, indicating she trusted me implicitly. We drove to the restaurant in complete silence. The streets of Atlanta were bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun. I pulled into the valet circle and handed my keys to the attendant. The heavy double doors of the restaurant were guarded by two large men in dark suits, but they stepped aside when I confidently gave them my name. The moment I walked into the grand dining room, the rich smell of roasted garlic butter and slow-smoked barbecue hit me. The room was absolutely packed with people wearing their finest Sunday church clothes and flashy jewelry. A live jazz band was playing a smooth, upbeat melody on the center stage. Waiters circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with crystal glasses full of expensive champagne. Marcus was sitting at the largest table right in the center of the room. He was wearing a ridiculous velvet dinner jacket and laughing loudly with a group of local investors. Bradley and Chloe were sitting right beside him. Chloe had clearly spent the morning on a massive shopping spree. She was covered in brand new diamond jewelry and carrying a handbag that cost more than most people made in a year. Bradley was leaning back in his chair, smoking a thick cigar and looking incredibly pleased with himself. They were all completely intoxicated by their own bottomless arrogance. They were celebrating the money they had secured through the bridge loan, completely unaware that the federal government was already meticulously tracking every single fraudulent signature they had provided to the bank. It took less than 30 seconds for someone to notice my arrival. The whispers started at the tables near the entrance and spread rapidly across the dining room like a shockwave. People turned their heads to stare at the woman who had supposedly been legally and financially destroyed just a few days prior. The smooth jazz music seemed to fade into the background as the collective attention of the entire room locked onto me and Maya. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high. I walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the room, letting the heavy silence amplify my presence. Chloe was the very first person to react. She practically leaped out of her chair, tossing her expensive linen napkin onto her plate. She marched directly toward me with an ugly, malicious sneer twisting her features. She intentionally planted herself right in the middle of the aisle, physically blocking my path to the main tables. She crossed her arms and looked me up and down with absolute contempt. She asked me if I had come to beg for scraps from their table. She spoke loudly, making sure the surrounding guests could hear her cruel mockery. She told me that I had a lot of nerve showing my face at a private celebration after losing my mind in court. She leaned in close and proudly declared that the money my disabled kid made was completely theirs now, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. She told me to turn around and walk out before she had security throw me onto the pavement. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer her the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. I looked at Chloe as if she were nothing more than a minor stain on the carpet. I tightened my grip on the hand of my daughter and stepped forward. I physically brushed past Chloe, bringing my shoulder hard against hers and knocking her completely off balance. She stumbled backward in her ridiculously high heels, letting out a loud gasp of pure shock. She was entirely unprepared for my absolute refusal to cower. I did not stop walking. I bypassed the VIP tables and walked straight toward the elevated wooden stage where the jazz band was playing. The musicians noticed my determined approach and slowly stopped playing their instruments. The drummer lowered his sticks and the saxophone player took a step back. The sudden absence of music plunged the massive dining room into a suffocating absolute silence. Every single eye in the building was glued to me. I stepped up onto the stage and calmly reached out to take the main microphone from the heavy metal stand. I looked out over the sea of wealthy guests. I saw Marcus sitting at his center table. He had a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand and a look of deep confusion masking his face. He quickly replaced the confusion with a wide, arrogant smirk. He genuinely believed that the crushing weight of his legal victory had finally broken me. He thought I was standing on that stage to make a desperate public plea for mercy. He thought I was going to cry and beg him to let me see my daughter. He thought he had completely won the war, and this was my public surrender. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed with pristine clarity through the state-of-the-art sound system. I told the crowd that I wanted to take a moment to publicly recognize the man of the hour. I directed the attention of the entire room straight to Marcus. I told the guests that we were all gathered here today to celebrate a truly historic financial acquisition. I raised an imaginary glass in the air and formally congratulated Marcus Caldwell on successfully acquiring the complete art portfolio of the anonymous genius known as NM. I announced to the elite crowd that Marcus had used his impressive business acumen to secure those assets through his prestigious company, Caldwell Holdings. I praised him for taking on the massive financial responsibility associated with such a highly valued artistic estate. I made sure to emphasize the words financial responsibility and corporate acquisition. My tone was flawlessly professional and dripping with a subtle venom that only a few people in the room were smart enough to detect. Marcus laughed out loud. It was a deep, booming sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. He leaned back in his chair and raised his glass of bourbon toward the stage, accepting my words as the ultimate admission of defeat. He basked in the admiring looks of the investors sitting at his table. He genuinely thought my speech was a pathetic attempt to save face and show submission in front of his wealthy peers. He smiled at me with his terrible, arrogant teeth, assuming that his hostile takeover of our lives was complete and irreversible. Bradley chuckled loudly beside him, slapping his hand on the table and nodding in agreement. They thought the bridge loan cash sitting in their accounts made them absolute invincible gods. I kept my eyes locked directly on the face of my ex-husband. I watched him enjoy the absolute peak of his miserable life. I wanted to burn the image of his smug, smiling face into my memory, because I knew it was the very last time he would ever smile as a free man. I lowered the microphone slightly. I did not say another word. I simply waited. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The heavy silence in the restaurant began to feel strange and uncomfortable. Marcus lowered his glass, his smile faltering slightly as he realized I was not stepping down from the stage. He realized I was not crying or looking defeated. I was looking at him with the cold, dead eyes of an executioner watching the lever drop. At that exact moment, the massive double doors at the front entrance of the restaurant swung open with a violent echoing crash. The sound made half the room jump in terror. The 2 large security guards who had been standing at the door were roughly pushed aside. Attorney David Sterling walked into the dining room. He was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit and carrying his heavy leather briefcase. His face was set in an expression of absolute grim determination. But David was not walking alone. Flanking him on either side were two federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests. Their hands were resting carefully near the heavy black belts at their waists. The entire restaurant erupted into a chaotic chorus of frightened gasps and panicked whispers. The wealthy elite of Atlanta instantly shrank back in their chairs, desperately trying to distance themselves from whatever federal nightmare was walking through the room. The loud, arrogant laugh died completely in the throat of my ex-husband. His glass of expensive bourbon slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered violently against the hardwood floor. The amber liquid pooled around his expensive leather shoes. Bradley turned completely pale, the color draining out of his arrogant face as he stared at the federal agents marching purposefully toward their table. Chloe let out a high-pitched whimper of absolute terror. I stood on the stage holding the hand of my beautiful, brilliant daughter. I watched the profound, blinding panic wash over the men who had tried to destroy us. The trap had been perfectly laid, and the heavy steel jaws were finally snapping shut. The federal agents moved through the room with terrifying synchronized precision. They did not look at the wealthy patrons or the expensive food scattered across the tables. Their eyes were locked directly on Marcus and Bradley. David Sterling walked right up to the center table and placed his leather briefcase firmly onto the white linen cloth. The sheer presence of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in such an upscale social setting was a catastrophic event that would ruin the reputation of anyone associated with it. Marcus realized instantly that his carefully constructed facade of wealth and power was evaporating into thin air. He tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to betray him. He braced his hands against the table, his knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. He looked wildly around the room, trying to find an escape route, but the agents had already positioned themselves to block any sudden movements. Bradley was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, as he realized that his personal guarantee on the massive bridge loan had just invited the federal government straight into his life. I remained perfectly still on the elevated stage. The microphone was cold against my palm. I could see the exact moment the devastating reality of the situation crashed down upon my former family. They had spent the last 11 years believing that there were absolutely no consequences for their monstrous actions. They believed they could abandon, discard, and steal from vulnerable people without ever facing justice. They thought they could simply forge some documents, bribe a few officials, and take everything I had built. But they had fundamentally underestimated the profound, terrifying power of a mother defending her child. I had not spent the last decade crying over my broken marriage. I had spent it mastering the complex, ruthless laws of high finance, corporate asset protection, and federal banking regulations. I had built an intricate financial maze designed specifically to capture greedy, arrogant predators. I looked down at Maya. She was watching the chaotic scene with absolute calm. Her noise-canceling headphones protected her from the panicked voices of the crowd. She knew that the bad men who had broken into her art studio and destroyed her sensory toys were finally going to be taken away. She squeezed my hand again, a silent, beautiful affirmation of our unbreakable bond. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at me standing on the stage. The smug, arrogant Victor was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate man, drowning in the consequences of his own bottomless greed. His lips moved, forming silent words of disbelief. He could not comprehend how the helpless public school teacher he had discarded had managed to summon federal agents to his celebration dinner. He could not understand that the $3.8 million prize he thought he had won was actually the very anvil that was about to drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. I gave him one final freezing smile, the kind of smile that promises absolute, irreversible destruction. I lowered the microphone and gently guided my daughter down the stairs of the stage. The real lesson was about to begin, and I wanted to be standing right in front of him when the federal government completely dismantled his entire life. The lighting in the restaurant seemed to dim, emphasizing the stark, serious nature of the federal agents. The wealthy guests who had been eager to drink Marcus's champagne just moments ago were now actively pulling their chairs away from his table. No one wanted to be caught in the splash zone of a federal investigation. Politicians and business owners were quietly slipping out the side doors, leaving Marcus completely isolated in the center of the room. Chloe was shaking uncontrollably, her fake designer jewelry clinking loudly in the quiet room. She looked to Bradley for protection, but Bradley was staring at David Sterling with wide, terrified eyes. Bradley knew what it meant when the feds showed up alongside a high-powered attorney. It meant the documentation was airtight, and the evidence of fraud was undeniable. I walked slowly through the parted crowd, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The path to their table felt incredibly long but deeply rewarding. Every step I took was a reclamation of the power they had tried to steal from me. 11 years of silent struggle, 11 years of scraping by to afford medical care, 11 years of hiding our brilliance in the shadows had all led to this exact moment of ultimate vindication. David Sterling saw me approaching and offered a slight respectful nod. He unlatched the heavy brass locks of his briefcase. The metallic click echoed sharply in the tense quiet of the dining room. Marcus flinched at the sound. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, and now he had absolutely none. The federal agent stood stoically waiting for David to present the documents that would legally authorize the immediate arrest of the men sitting at the table. I stopped directly across the table from Marcus. I did not say a word. I just let him look at me and realize the absolute magnitude of his failure. The extravagant soul food dinner, the live jazz band, the expensive bourbon, and the flashy suits were all just temporary props in a play that I had directed from the very beginning. He thought he was the master of his own fate, but he was merely a pawn moving exactly where I needed him to go. The real power was never in the loud, arrogant boasting. The real power was in the silent, meticulous preparation of a mother who refused to be a victim ever again. The restaurant doors remained closed behind the agents sealing Marcus and his greedy enablers inside the tomb they had dug with their own hands. The hook was set deep, and there was absolutely no escape. I stood tall, knowing the next phase of the plan was about to shatter his reality into a million unrecoverable pieces. The heavy wooden doors of the soul food restaurant remained sealed shut by the federal agent standing guard. The room was frozen in a state of absolute terror and confusion. I stood on the elevated stage with my daughter holding her hand tightly. I looked down at Marcus, who was currently sitting in a puddle of his own spilled bourbon. His face was completely pale, and his eyes darted frantically around the room, trying to find an escape that did not exist. The wealthy politicians and business owners who had been laughing with him just moments ago were now completely silent. They were watching the scene unfold with morbid fascination and deep fear. I raised the microphone back to my lips, taking a slow, deep breath before I delivered the first crushing blow to his fragile false empire. Marcus, you really thought you had won the lottery when the auctioneer dropped his gavel in Buckhead, I said, my voice cutting through the thick, heavy silence of the dining room. You thought you had secured $3.8 million of pure liquid cash. You thought you could just waltz into our lives after 11 years of abandonment and steal the future I built for Maya. You threw a celebration dinner tonight to show off wealth that you do not even possess. You invited the absolute elite of Atlanta to watch you gloat. But you never stopped to ask yourself one very simple, crucial question. You were so blinded by your own bottomless greed that you never bothered to investigate the anonymous buyer sitting in the back row of the gallery. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face turning a blotchy shade of crimson. Chloe was gripping the edge of the table, her fake diamond bracelets trembling against the white linen cloth. I walked slowly across the stage, pacing back and forth, so everyone in the room could hear exactly how I had dismantled their arrogant schemes. I told Marcus that the art world is built entirely on perception and smoke. I explained that anyone with enough capital and a decent lawyer can create a bidding war out of thin air. You see, Marcus, the man in the back of the gallery, who bid $3.8 million for the painting, was not a wealthy art collector from New York. He was a hired proxy. He was bidding on behalf of a private entity. I watched the confusion slowly warp into pure dread on the face of my ex-husband. I told him that the entity was a Delaware shell company registered under a blind trust, a shell company that I meticulously established 3 years ago using the profits from my underground art brokerage firm. The entire restaurant gasped in unison. The sound of 50 wealthy patrons realizing the magnitude of my deception echoed off the high ceilings. I smiled coldly at Marcus and delivered the truth. The $3.8 million does not exist, Marcus. I bought my own daughter's painting. The money in the escrow account is entirely phantom cash. I moved funds from one of my hidden accounts to another, simply to generate a heavily inflated public valuation for her artwork. It was a completely legal market manipulation tactic, I explained smoothly over the microphone. I artificially pumped the value of her art to set a permanent price floor for her future gallery exhibitions. There is no rich buyer waiting to transfer clean money to your bank account. There is only me. Bradley suddenly leaped out of his chair, knocking over a crystal water glass in his sheer panic. The glass shattered onto the floor, adding to the debris surrounding their table. Bradley pointed a shaking finger at me, his face contorted with absolute terrified rage. "You are lying," he shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You are completely lying to scare us. The bank manager verified the funds in the escrow account yesterday morning. We saw the federal holding documents with our own eyes." Bradley was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his expensive pinstripe suit. He yelled that the bank would never have approved a commercial bridge loan if the asset was fake. He screamed that they had done their due diligence and that I was just a crazy, bitter woman trying to ruin their celebration. He turned to the federal agents and demanded that they arrest me for fraud instead. The FBI agents did not even blink. They remained perfectly still, watching Bradley unravel like a cornered rat. I did not need to respond to his pathetic outburst. I simply stepped back and gestured toward David Sterling. My attorney stepped forward into the center of the room, his leather briefcase held firmly in his left hand. David looked at Bradley with deep professional pity. David calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket and pulled a thick stack of authenticated banking documents from his briefcase. He laid the papers flat on the table right next to the spilled bourbon. "Mr. Bradley," David said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "My client is not lying. The funds in the escrow account are real, but they are restricted under a specific closed-loop corporate structure. The bank verified the existence of the money, but they also noted the federal anti-money laundering flag. That flag was not triggered by a foreign buyer. It was triggered manually by the managing director of the Delaware Shell Company. The director placed an indefinite administrative hold on the release of the funds due to an ongoing internal corporate audit, and the sole director of that company is Naomi Jenkins." Bradley stared at the documents, his eyes wide with absolute mounting horror. He began to pull at his expensive silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. David continued his explanation, slicing through their arrogance with cold, hard legal facts. He explained the concept of ghost money to the silent dining room. He told Bradley that the $3.8 million was effectively trapped in a legal vacuum. It could not be liquidated, transferred, or accessed by anyone, including the temporary conservator. Marcus had no authority to force a corporate entity to release funds while it was under self-imposed administrative review. Therefore, the asset backing their massive commercial bridge loan had exactly zero immediate liquidity. It was a phantom asset floating in a financial void. Chloe started crying loud, pathetic sobs that annoyed everyone in her immediate vicinity. She grabbed Bradley by the arm, begging him to explain what David meant. She wailed about her shopping sprees and the vacation homes they were supposed to buy. Bradley roughly shoved her hand away, completely consumed by his own terrifying realization. "But we signed the bridge loan," Bradley muttered, his voice trembling wildly. "The bank gave us the cash advance based on the gallery appraisal." "The bank gave it to us." David offered a sharp, predatory smile. "Yes, Bradley, the bank gave you a massive cash loan because you provided a personal corporate guarantee. The bank did not care if the painting took 10 years to clear escrow because you collateralized your entire real estate brokerage firm to secure the advance. You put your house, your business, and every single penny you have ever earned on the chopping block to guarantee a loan for a man who has absolutely zero assets. David pointed directly at Marcus, who was sitting completely frozen in his chair. Marcus was staring blankly at the wall, his brain finally processing the catastrophic magnitude of his own stupidity. He had let Bradley handle the financial paperwork because he wanted the money fast. He had not bothered to hire an independent lawyer to read the fine print. He just wanted to drive a new Porsche and flaunt his stolen wealth in front of the city elite. Now he was realizing that he had played right into a massive, devastating financial trap. I watched the color drain completely out of the face of my ex-husband. I walked slowly down the short flight of stairs from the stage, leading Maya carefully by the hand. The crowd parted for us, automatically giving us a wide, clear path to the center table. I stopped right in front of Marcus, looking down at his pathetic, miserable form. "You thought you could use the legal system to steal my daughter and her hard-earned money?" I said softly, but with enough force to carry across the quiet room. "You thought family court was the only battlefield that mattered. You thought a piece of paper missing my signature made you powerful. But you completely ignored the financial battlefield where I have spent the last 11 years building an untouchable fortress." I leaned over the table, placing both of my hands flat against the white linen cloth. I brought my face incredibly close to his, so he could see the absolute, unwavering destruction in my eyes. I told him that he was nothing more than a greedy, impatient fool. I told him that a smart man would have waited for the 90-day escrow period to clear before spending a single dime. A smart man would have verified the buyer. But greedy men never wait. Greedy men always want the fast cash, and they are always willing to sign anything to get it. You took out a massive bank loan, backed by absolutely nothing but ghost money, and your arrogant brother-in-law provided the collateral. Bradley was weeping now, real heavy tears of absolute financial ruin streaming down his red, blotchy face. He realized that he had just handed his entire life over to the bank for a completely worthless cause. He was going to lose his firm, his clients, and his home because he wanted to skim a profit off a disabled teenager. But my revenge was not quite finished. The ghost money and the worthless collateral were only the beginning of their punishment. I stood up straight and smoothed out the fabric of my pristine white tailored suit. I looked at David, who gave me a subtle nod of approval. The federal agents were still standing perfectly still, waiting for the final revelation to drop before they moved in to make the official arrests. I raised my voice one last time to address the shattered men sitting at the table. But the bridge loan was not just a simple cash advance. I announced, my tone carrying the heavy weight of absolute doom. "You see, Marcus, when you rushed into the bank and forced the trust to accept that loan, using your temporary guardianship, you did not just sign a borrowing agreement. You signed a deeply buried financial landmine." I had David hide a very specific corporate restructuring clause deep within the hundreds of pages of that bank contract. "You were in such a desperate hurry to get your hands on my daughter's money that you blindly signed it without reading a single word. And now Bradley has just stepped right onto that perfectly laid landmine. The trap was utterly inescapable. Every single arrogant decision you made has legally bound you to an absolute nightmare. You wanted to take everything from us, but instead, you just surrendered everything you have ever owned. The game is completely over, Marcus, and you have lost absolutely everything. You are finished. The federal agents are ready now. You thought you were the smartest person in any room, but you were always the easiest mark, because you always let your ego make your choices. You wanted to play God with our lives, but all you did was construct your own prison cell. I hope you remember this moment every single day. You sit behind bars knowing that the woman you discarded was the one who finally locked the door and threw away the key. Your entire empire was always built on sand, and now the tide has finally come in to wash you away for good. Marcus Caldwell. The silence that followed my words was so absolute that you could hear the ice melting in the abandoned cocktail glasses across the room. I did not stay on the elevated stage. I slowly walked down the wooden steps, leaving Maya safely standing next to David Sterling and the federal agents. My pristine white tailored suit seemed to glow under the warm restaurant lights as I moved deliberately toward the center table. The crowd of wealthy Atlanta elites automatically parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody dared to breathe, let alone speak. They were witnessing the brutal, systematic execution of a man who had tried to play God with our lives. The rich smell of roasted garlic and barbecue that had filled the soul food restaurant earlier was now completely overpowered by the sour, unmistakable stench of pure human terror. I stopped directly in front of Marcus and Bradley. The spilled bourbon on their table had soaked into the crisp white linen cloth, creating an ugly dark stain that perfectly mirrored their current situation. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded document. It was a certified copy of the exact commercial bridge loan contract they had so eagerly signed at the bank yesterday morning. I dropped the thick stack of papers right into the center of the bourbon stain. The heavy thud made both men flinch as if I had just dropped a loaded weapon onto their laps. I looked down at Marcus and asked him if he knew what a debt swap was. I watched his eyes dart nervously toward the damp paperwork. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was too dry to produce a sound. I leaned over the table, placing my hands flat against the edges, and decided to spell it out for him like he was a slow, misbehaving child. I explained that when he rushed into that bank demanding liquid cash, he used his temporary court-ordered guardianship to force my daughter's financial estate to accept the terms of the loan. He thought he was just borrowing money against a highly valued painting. He was in such a desperate hurry to buy a sports car and flaunt his stolen wealth that he did not bother to read the fine print. I told him that David Sterling and I had spent months crafting that specific lending agreement with a network of aggressive corporate lenders who specialized in distressed asset liquidations. Every single clause was a carefully laid trap designed specifically for his bottomless greed. Marcus stared at me, his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. I told him that his failing trucking logistics company was currently drowning in exactly $5 million of federal back taxes. He had been dodging the Internal Revenue Service for years, hiding behind fraudulent shell accounts and shady bookkeeping. But when he signed that bridge loan as the conservator for my daughter, he legally merged his toxic corporate entity into her financial portfolio. He thought he was taking control of her assets, but legally, he was mingling his own garbage into her estate. What he did not know was that I had already established an irrevocable special needs trust for Maya the very moment she sold her first sketch years ago. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the devastating legal facts wash over him. Under strict United States federal law, an irrevocable special needs trust is absolutely bulletproof against all outside creditors. It is a legal fortress designed specifically by the government to protect disabled individuals from financial predators. By dumping his failing company into her trust to secure the loan, Marcus successfully shielded the corporate entity from the government. The company itself was now a protected asset belonging entirely to Maya. But the massive tax liability did not simply disappear. The $5 million in federal tax debt had to go somewhere. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the top page of the damp contract. According to the meticulous restructuring clause, buried on page 47 of the document, he signed the debt was legally severed from the business and transferred directly to the individuals who personally guaranteed the bridge loan. Those individuals were Marcus and his arrogant brother-in-law, Bradley. The room was so quiet, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the expensive gold watch on Marcus's wrist. I told him that he did not just fail to steal my daughter's money, he had actually gifted her his entire company while personally assuming $5 million in inescapable toxic debt. I slowly shifted my gaze away from my ex-husband and looked directly at Bradley, the hot-shot white real estate broker who had intentionally bumped into me in the courthouse hallway and told me to dump my disabled daughter in an orphanage was currently struggling to pull air into his lungs. His face had drained of all color, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. Sweat was beading on his forehead and his eyes were wide with a horrifying realization. He was a real estate broker. He dealt with contracts and liens every single day. He knew exactly what the Internal Revenue Service did to people who owed them millions. He stared at the contract on the table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike his throat. I addressed Bradley next, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. I told him that his towering arrogance had completely blinded him to reality. He had confidently collateralized his entire life to back a loan for a phantom asset. He had put his premier real estate brokerage firm, his multi-million-dollar suburban mansion, his luxury cars, and his personal retirement accounts on the line to guarantee a $5 million toxic debt for a man he secretly despised. He had done it all because he thought he could skim a massive profit off a disabled teenager and a desperate mother. I asked Bradley how it felt to know that the federal bank was going to seize absolutely everything he had ever owned by tomorrow morning. Bradley realized in real time that his life as a wealthy, privileged elite was instantly over. His arrogant swagger completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, broken shell of a man. He let out a guttural, agonizing sound that was half scream and half sob. He grabbed the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white as his entire body began to shake violently. He looked at Chloe, who was staring back at him in mute horror, her hands covering her mouth. She realized that her brand-new designer jewelry and her lavish shopping sprees were about to be confiscated by federal agents. Bradley turned his wild, desperate eyes toward Marcus. The toxic alliance they had formed to destroy me was rapidly deteriorating under the crushing weight of their mutual financial ruin. Bradley completely snapped. The sophisticated facade of the successful broker shattered into a million jagged pieces. He lunged out of his chair, throwing his entire body weight across the table and knocking over plates of expensive food and crystal silverware. He grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his ridiculous velvet dinner jacket and began screaming at the top of his lungs. Bradley cursed Marcus, calling him a worthless scam artist and a pathetic loser. He screamed that his life was ruined, that he had lost his firm and his home because of a stupid, arrogant mistake and a useless brother-in-law. Spittle flew from Bradley's mouth as he violently shook Marcus back and forth, demanding that Marcus fix the situation immediately. Marcus tried to push him away, but Bradley was fueled by the sheer adrenaline of total panic. Bradley pulled his fist back and drove it hard into the side of Marcus's face. The sound of the punch connecting echoed sharply in the quiet restaurant. Marcus reeled backward, crashing into his chair and tumbling to the floor in a tangled mess of limbs and expensive fabric. Chloe shrieked in terror, scrambling away from the violence and cowering behind an empty chair. The wealthy patrons who had come to celebrate with them gasped in shock, taking several steps back to avoid the brawl. The elegant dining room was now a scene of absolute degrading chaos. Marcus struggled to his feet, wiping blood that was trickling from his split lip. He was completely unhinged. He looked around the room and saw the disgusted faces of the politicians and investors he had tried so hard to impress. He realized that he had no money, no company, no allies, and $5 million in inescapable federal debt hanging over his head. He was entirely cornered. The federal agents were standing just a few feet away, watching the two criminals turn on each other like starved animals. Marcus knew he was going to federal prison, and there was absolutely no legal loophole left to save him. Marcus looked up from the ruined table, his eyes completely wild and bloodshot. He saw me stand there, perfectly calm, perfectly unbothered, watching his world burn to ash, just as he had burned mine 11 years ago. The realization that a woman he considered weak and disposable had orchestrated his absolute destruction broke whatever fragile grip he still had on his sanity. With a raw, animalistic roar, Marcus scrambled over the debris of the table, sending broken glass and food flying everywhere. He lunged directly across the table, his hands outstretched, his eyes filled with pure murderous rage, aiming straight for my throat. The sudden explosive violence happened so fast that nobody in the restaurant had time to react. Marcus cleared the ruined center table in a single desperate leap, his hands hooked into claws aiming directly for me. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. But he never made it across the remaining distance. Before his hands could even graze the fabric of my tailored suit, the two federal agents moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. One agent slammed his heavy shoulder directly into Marcus's chest, stopping his momentum completely. The second agent grabbed Marcus by his velvet lapels and aggressively swept his legs out from under him. Marcus hit the hardwood floor with a sickening thud, the breath knocked entirely out of his lungs. The agents instantly flipped him onto his stomach, pressing a heavy knee directly into the center of his back to keep him pinned against the spilled bourbon and broken glass. Marcus thrashed wildly on the floor, kicking his expensive shoes against the legs of the shattered table. He was completely unhinged, his mind entirely shattered by the sudden catastrophic destruction of his life. He twisted his neck to look up at me, his eyes bloodshot and filled with absolute venom. "You evil butch!" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as the agents forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. "You set me up. You used a disabled kid to scam me. You ruined my entire life." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold professional satisfaction. I did not need to raise my voice or defend myself against his pathetic accusations. Because at that exact moment, the true architect of his destruction stepped forward. The entire restaurant, which had been filled with the sounds of a desperate, struggling man and screaming guests, suddenly fell entirely silent. The silence was so profound it felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the massive dining room. Maya slowly released her grip on my hand. She walked carefully down the wooden steps of the stage, ignoring the chaotic mess of broken glass and expensive food scattered across the floor. She stopped just a few feet away from the men who had relentlessly mocked her as a useless burden for over a decade. She did not flinch. She did not rock back and forth. She did not show a single ounce of fear as she stared down at the man who claimed to be her biological father. Maya reached into the pocket of her soft cotton dress and pulled out her augmentative and alternative communication device. The small screen illuminated her beautiful, calm face in the dim lighting of the restaurant. Her fingers flew across the digital keyboard with the speed and precision of a master pianist. She was typing out her final, undeniable statement to the world. She pressed the audio release button, and the device connected seamlessly to the powerful restaurant speakers above our heads. The robotic yet profoundly powerful voice echoed through the dining room, slicing through the heavy tension like a sharp blade. "The painting is called The Silence of Chaos." Maya's digital voice announced clearly and methodically. The words hung in the air, forcing every single person in the room to listen. "It was a trap I painted just for you. Do not call my mother evil. She is my teacher and my protector. The trash has finally been taken out." Marcus stopped struggling against the federal agents. His eyes widened in absolute horrifying realization as he stared up at the 15-year-old autistic girl he had so completely underestimated. He finally understood that the genius behind the $3.8 million masterpiece was not just a tool for his greed. She was fully aware, entirely capable, and directly responsible for his ultimate downfall. He had been outsmarted by the child he abandoned and the woman he discarded. The heavy silence was suddenly broken by the piercing wail of police sirens approaching rapidly from the street outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the large windows of the restaurant, painting the terrified faces of the guests in alternating colors. The federal agent, pressing his knee into Marcus's back, finally pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic click of the cuffs locking around Marcus's wrists was the final absolute sound of his defeat. "Marcus Caldwell," the agent said, his voice booming with official federal authority. "You are under arrest for federal bank fraud, falsifying commercial loan documents, and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The agent hauled Marcus roughly to his feet, spinning him around to face the front doors. Bradley was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass, completely paralyzed by the realization that his entire life was over. He was sobbing openly, his arrogant pride completely destroyed by the $5 million debt that was now legally tied to his name. Chloe was curled up in a chair, weeping pathetically as she watched her brother being marched out of the restaurant in handcuffs. The grand celebration dinner had become the site of their ultimate financial and legal execution. I placed my hand gently back onto Maya's shoulder. She looked up at me and offered a small, brilliant smile. We had done it. We had built an empire in the shadows and used it to completely dismantle the people who thought we were weak. The trap had worked perfectly, and the predators were finally locked away in the cages they had built for themselves. The flashing red and blue police lights faded into the distance as the patrol car carrying my ex-husband disappeared down the dark Atlanta street. The upscale soul food restaurant, which had been the site of his extravagant celebration just an hour ago, was now a complete disaster zone. Federal agents were busy cataloging the documents David had provided and securing the perimeter. I stood near the center stage holding my daughter's hand, simply taking in the absolute silence that had fallen over the remaining guests. But the silence did not last long. Chloe was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the shattered remains of crystal glasses and ruined food. She had watched her brother get hauled away in handcuffs, and she had watched her husband Bradley completely lose his mind over their insurmountable debt. When she finally processed that the federal government was going to seize every single asset tied to their names, a new kind of panic set into her eyes. She scrambled up from the floor, her expensive silk dress stained with spilled bourbon and dirt. She stumbled directly toward me, pushing past an empty chair. She did not yell or threaten me this time. The arrogant, vicious woman who had blocked the restaurant door and told me I was a bitter, broke loser was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate coward. Chloe literally dropped to her knees right in front of me on the hardwood floor. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of my white tailored suit. Heavy mascara-stained tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Naomi, please!" she sobbed, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "You have to stop this. You have to tell your lawyer to undo the contract." Bradley and I had no idea what Marcus was really doing. He lied to us. He manipulated us into signing those banking documents. "We are family, Naomi. You cannot let the bank take my house and my cars. We are family and you have to help us." I looked down at her grasping hands, dirtying my pristine clothes. I felt absolutely no sympathy for the woman sobbing at my feet. I reached down and coldly pried her heavily manicured fingers off my suit. I stepped back, creating a distinct physical boundary between us. I kept my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. I told Chloe that she seemed to have a very convenient memory problem. I reminded her of a freezing night 10 years ago when I stood on her porch begging for a simple $2,000 loan to buy critical medication for Maya. I reminded her that she had stood there sipping expensive wine while her husband told me to dump my disabled child into a state-run orphanage. I asked her where her profound sense of family loyalty was on that night when my daughter was sick and we were facing eviction. "You completely forgot about the concept of family when you told me to throw Maya away like garbage," I said, staring dead into her panicked eyes. "You forgot about family when you committed blatant perjury on a witness stand just to help your brother steal millions of dollars from a child. You made your choices, Chloe, and you made them with a smile on your face. Now you get to experience the absolute destruction you enthusiastically signed up for. Have fun in bankruptcy court." I turned my back on her pathetic weeping form and guided Maya toward the exit, leaving Chloe crumpled on the floor of the ruined restaurant. The legal and financial slaughter that followed over the next few weeks was swift, brutal, and entirely publicly documented. The news of the FBI raid and the massive fraudulent bridge loan hit the Atlanta financial sector the very next morning. Bradley drove to his prestigious real estate brokerage firm, hoping to somehow salvage his career, but his access badge had already been deactivated. The board of directors had held an emergency meeting at dawn and voted unanimously to terminate his employment immediately. No reputable financial institution wanted anything to do with a broker who was actively under federal investigation for bank fraud and tax evasion. The federal government and the commercial banks moved with terrifying speed to recover their losses. They froze all of Bradley and Chloe's domestic accounts. Tow trucks arrived at their multi-million-dollar suburban mansion to repossess their luxury vehicles. Federal auditors swept through their home, cataloging expensive artwork, designer bags, and rare jewelry to be seized and auctioned off to pay down the toxic $5 million debt they had so arrogantly guaranteed. The facade of their elite upper-class lifestyle evaporated overnight, leaving them with absolutely nothing but mounting legal bills. The extreme financial pressure instantly shattered their toxic marriage. Bradley blamed Chloe for convincing him to help her worthless brother. Chloe blamed Bradley for being stupid enough to sign a commercial loan without reading the fine print. They filed for a vicious, highly publicized divorce that became premium gossip for the entire city. They spent their remaining borrowed pennies fighting each other in court, leaking embarrassing private details to the media, and blaming each other for their total ruin. They destroyed whatever dignity they had left fighting over scraps, while drowning in a sea of inescapable debt. Marcus faced an even worse fate. His high-priced defense attorney abandoned him the exact second his retainer check bounced due to the frozen accounts. He was assigned an exhausted public defender, who took one look at the mountain of irrefutable evidence David Sterling had compiled and advised him to plead guilty. The federal prosecutors had airtight documentation proving wire fraud, bank fraud, tax evasion, and the falsification of commercial loan documents. I attended his sentencing hearing sitting quietly in the back row of the federal courtroom. Marcus looked incredibly small and diminished sitting at the defense table in a faded orange jumpsuit. The flashy tailored suits and heavy gold watches were long gone. He looked back at me once, but I offered him no reaction. The federal judge did not show him an ounce of leniency. The judge admonished Marcus for his extreme greed and his blatant attempt to exploit a vulnerable, disabled minor for personal financial gain. The gavel came down with a heavy crack, sentencing Marcus Caldwell to 7 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I watched him being led away in handcuffs, feeling a profound sense of closure, knowing he could never hurt us again. But the most important legal victory was still waiting to be claimed. The criminal trials and the financial ruin of my enemies were deeply satisfying, but my ultimate goal had always been the absolute protection of my daughter. A few weeks after Marcus was sent to prison, David Sterling and I returned to the Fulton County Family Court for the final guardianship hearing. The atmosphere in the courthouse was completely different this time. The corrupt judge who had initially granted Marcus the emergency conservatorship was conspicuously absent. David had quietly forwarded a file of discrepancies regarding that judge's recent rulings to the State Ethics Board, and the judge had been abruptly placed on administrative leave pending a massive bribery investigation. We were standing in front of a new, completely impartial judge who was known for her strict adherence to child welfare standards. The new judge spent nearly an hour meticulously reviewing the massive boxes of evidence David presented. She read through the 11 years of medical records, therapy logs, and school reports, proving that I had been the sole dedicated provider for Maya. She reviewed the banking documents proving Marcus had stolen the original adoption funds a decade ago. She read the transcripts of his recent federal fraud conviction, which perfectly highlighted his complete lack of moral character and his extreme danger to the child's well-being. The courtroom was incredibly quiet. As the judge finally looked up from the heavy stacks of paper, she looked at me sitting at the plaintiff's table holding my daughter's hand. Her expression was soft, but filled with profound judicial authority. This court has rarely seen such a blatant, egregious attempt to weaponize the legal system for personal financial gain, she stated firmly. Mr. Caldwell completely abandoned his parental responsibilities over a decade ago, and his recent actions prove he views this child as nothing more than a commodity. That is entirely unacceptable under the laws of this state. She picked up her pen and looked directly at the court reporter to ensure her next words were permanently etched into the legal record. Therefore, I am officially stripping Marcus Caldwell of all parental rights, effective immediately. He will have no legal standing, no visitation rights, and no claim to any assets belonging to this child now or in the future. The judge then pulled a fresh, crisp document to the center of her desk. She looked at me with a genuinely warm smile. Mrs. Jenkins, the evidence clearly shows that you have been the true mother to this child in every conceivable way. It is the great privilege of this court to correct an administrative failure that is 10 years overdue. I am officially granting your petition for full legal adoption and assigning you as the sole permanent guardian of Maya. She signed her name across the bottom of the decree with a bold, definitive stroke and brought her gavel down. The sound echoed through the courtroom, not as a weapon of destruction, but as the ultimate unbreakable seal of our protection. The missing piece of paper was finally signed. Maya was legally permanently mine, and no one could ever take her away from me again. I let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs for 11 long years. Tears of pure, overwhelming relief pricked the corners of my eyes. I pulled Maya into a tight, fierce embrace, burying my face in her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around my neck and hummed a happy, comfortable melody, entirely unaware of the complex legal battles, but fully aware that she was incredibly safe. David Sterling packed up his briefcase, offering me a wide, genuine smile of congratulations before stepping out to file the final registration paperwork. We walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse together, stepping through the heavy glass doors into the bright, warm Atlanta sunshine. The heavy, suffocating clouds of anxiety and fear that had followed us for so long were completely gone. The air tasted incredibly sweet, and the future stretched out before us filled with endless brilliant possibilities. We had survived the darkest shadows, and we had emerged totally victorious. I kept my arms securely wrapped around Maya's shoulders as we walked down the wide concrete steps toward the street where our car was parked. I was already planning how we would celebrate tonight, thinking about ordering her favorite food and spending the evening painting together in her studio. We were just a few feet away from the curb when a sleek black town car slowly pulled up and parked directly in our path. The tinted back window rolled down smoothly and the rear door opened. A tall, elegantly dressed woman stepped out onto the sidewalk. She was wearing sharp, sophisticated designer clothing that made Chloe's fake brands look like cheap plastic. She carried an aura of intense, undeniable authority and wealth. I immediately recognized her face from the covers of international art magazines and elite gallery publications. She was a highly influential legendary figure in the global contemporary art world, known for making or breaking careers with a single sentence. She did not look in the courthouse or the passing traffic. Her sharp, intelligent eyes locked directly onto Maya and then shifted to meet my surprised gaze. She offered a small, polite smile, holding a pristine leather portfolio under her arm. She had been waiting by the curb specifically for us, and something told me our quiet, peaceful victory was about to launch us into a completely new, unimaginable stratosphere. The woman standing by the curb was an icon in the international contemporary art community. I recognized her immediately from the glossy covers of prestigious fine art magazines and the countless financial articles I had obsessively studied while building my underground brokerage empire. She was an elite gallery owner and a legendary private collector based in New York City. She was notoriously known for being utterly ruthless in her artistic standards and entirely indifferent to the petty social politics of the wealthy elite. She did not care about the federal investigation that was currently dominating the local news cycle. She did not care about the scandalous gossip that was tearing through the Atlanta high society after the dramatic FBI raid at the soul food restaurant. She only cared about raw, undeniable generational talent. As Maya and I approached her, she stepped forward and offered a highly respectful, polite nod. She did not try to shake my hand or invade our personal physical space, recognizing that Maya might be overwhelmed by the sudden proximity of a stranger. She simply held out the pristine leather portfolio she had been carrying under her arm and introduced herself with a quiet, commanding voice that cut through the lingering adrenaline of the afternoon. She explained that she had flown down from Manhattan the exact moment she heard about the Buckhead auction. She told me she knew the $3.8 million bid was a strategic market manipulation tactic, but she also knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the painting itself was a genuine, absolute masterpiece. She told me she had spent the last 3 days obsessively studying digital images of Maya's previous underground work. She called my daughter a once-in-a-generation visionary whose visceral use of color and sharp geometric fragmentation rivaled the greatest contemporary artists of our modern era. She did not want to buy ghost money or phantom assets. She proposed a fully legitimate multi-million-dollar exhibition contract. She wanted to feature Maya in an exclusive solo gallery showing in the heart of the New York Art District. She assured me, looking directly into my eyes with absolute professional sincerity, that her gallery would handle all the complex logistics, high-level security, and aggressive media relations, completely shielding my daughter from any unwanted public scrutiny or sensory overload. I took the heavy leather portfolio from her hands and thanked her for the incredibly generous offer. I told her my attorney would be in touch the very next morning to review the exact legal terms. 2 days later, David Sterling sat in the quiet living room of our secure rental apartment, carefully reviewing the massive contract. He shook his head in absolute quiet amazement as he read through the staggering financial figures presented on the thick premium paper. The New York Gallery was offering a massive 8-figure advance for the exclusive representation of Maya's future artistic portfolio. It was not a trick, and it was not a bridge loan. It was real, clean, highly liquid capital backed by one of the most powerful and respected artistic institutions in the world. David meticulously structured the representation agreement so that every single penny of the massive advance and all future ongoing royalties would be deposited directly into the impenetrable, irrevocable special needs trust we had established. The trust was now securely managed by a board of highly vetted independent fiduciaries, ensuring that Maya would have absolute total financial security for the rest of her natural life. No greedy relative, no opportunistic predator, and no arrogant former family member could ever touch a single dime of her fortune. She was completely and forever protected by an impenetrable wall of federal law and institutional wealth. With our draining legal battles finally concluded and our financial future completely guaranteed, it was time to leave the small off-the-grid rental apartment behind for good. We had spent 11 years living in the shadows, hiding from the ghosts of our past, and counting every single penny just to survive. Now we had the ultimate freedom to step into the light. We spent several weeks searching the lush green sprawling suburbs of Atlanta for the perfect place to call our permanent home. I wanted a physical space that felt like an absolute fortress of peace, entirely separated from the dark, chaotic memories of the past decade. We finally found a stunning, beautiful mid-century modern estate, nestled at the very end of a private, heavily wooded cul-de-sac. The magnificent house was surrounded by ancient towering oak trees and featured massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that flooded the spacious interior with brilliant natural light. It was a vast open space where Maya could roam freely and comfortably without the constant underlying fear of sudden loud noises or aggressive unwanted intrusions. The property had a large, sprawling backyard that rolled gently down toward a quiet, private lake, offering a level of serene tranquility we had never experienced before. The very first thing I did after we officially purchased the estate was hire a team of highly specialized contractors to build a custom state-of-the-art art studio specifically tailored to Maya's unique needs. I converted a massive detached carriage house on the property into her own personal creative sanctuary. I directed the builders to install premium acoustic soundproofing in the walls to completely block out any external distractions or harsh environmental noises. The overhead lighting was meticulously calibrated by specialists to mimic soft natural sunlight without being harsh buzzing or overwhelming to her sensitive eyes. I filled the massive room with the absolute highest quality canvases, specialized non-toxic imported paints, and comfortable, deeply cushioned sensory seating areas. When I finally led Maya into the completed studio, her reaction was the most beautiful, profound thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. She dropped my hand and walked slowly around the massive, bright room, running her delicate fingers over the smooth, fresh canvases and touching the fine bristles of the new, expensive paintbrushes. She spun around in the center of the room and let out a series of happy, melodic humming sounds that filled my heart with absolute, pure, overwhelming joy. She immediately walked over to her communication device and typed out a single sentence telling me that she was finally home. For the first few months in our beautiful new estate, Maya spent hours every single day locked away in her bright, sunlit studio. I watched from the doorway as her artistic style underwent a profound and incredibly beautiful transformation. The dark, aggressive crimsons, the heavy, suffocating black shadows, and the chaotic, sharp geometric shapes that had defined her previous highly sought-after work began to slowly disappear from her canvases. The deep anxiety and the lingering fear that she had poured into the silence of chaos were entirely, completely gone. She started painting with vibrant, exceptionally warm colors. She used bright, joyful yellows, soft, calming ocean blues, and brilliant, sweeping shades of gold. Her brushstrokes became fluid and sweeping instead of jagged and sharp. She was literally painting the profound feeling of safety on her canvases. She was painting the physical manifestation of our new beautiful life. One warm afternoon, She pulled me into the studio by my hand and pointed proudly to a massive completed canvas resting on her premium wooden easel. It was a stunning abstract interpretation of a bright golden sunrise breaking violently through a dense thicket of dark trees. She typed into her communication device and told me she had named the piece the morning after the storm. It was an absolute masterpiece that perfectly symbolized the definitive end of our dark, chaotic chapter and the brilliant, undeniable beginning of our total freedom. But the universe still had one final piece of sweet poetic justice to deliver to our doorstep. Nearly a year after the federal agents had dragged my desperate, arrogant ex-husband out of that soul food restaurant, his entire financial estate was completely systematically liquidated by the federal government. The massive suburban house that Marcus had lived in, the very house where he had aggressively flaunted his stolen wealth and plotted with Chloe and Bradley to steal my daughter's money, was officially seized by the bank. It sat entirely empty and decaying for months, until it was finally put up for a public county auction to settle the remaining fractions of his massive toxic federal debt. The property had been heavily damaged by complete neglect, and the massive legal liens attached to it made it highly undesirable to traditional commercial real estate investors. Nobody in the elite circles of Atlanta wanted anything to do with the tainted property of a convicted federal fraudster. When the auction day finally arrived, I sat quietly in the back row of the drab municipal building with attorney David Sterling sitting faithfully by my side. I wore a simple, elegant green dress and held a small bidding paddle in my hand, waiting patiently for the address to be called by the county clerk. I bid on the foreclosed property, and because of its toxic financial history and the total lack of competing investors, I won the auction for absolute pennies on the dollar. I purchased the very ground where my enemies had stood using the clean, legitimate funds from my own highly successful underground brokerage firm. I officially owned the dirt beneath the house of the man who had tried to destroy my daughter. A few weeks later, I drove Maya out to the property on a bright, clear Tuesday morning. We parked our car across the street and stood safely on the sidewalk, watching as a massive, heavy yellow bulldozer rolled onto the overgrown, unkempt lawn. I held my daughter's hand tightly as the operator threw the heavy machinery into gear. The massive steel blade crashed violently into the front porch, tearing through the brick and drywall with brutal, effortless power. We stood there in the warm morning sun for hours, watching the house of the man who had tormented us being methodically reduced to a giant pile of shattered wood and twisted, rusted metal. The physical manifestation of his towering, unearned arrogance was completely leveled to the ground, leaving absolutely nothing behind but an empty lot of fresh brown dirt. I did not buy the property to build another flashy mansion or to flip the real estate for a quick, massive profit. I had a much grander, deeply personal vision for that specific piece of land. I hired a team of brilliant architects to design a sprawling state-of-the-art community center. It was going to be a specialized, high-end art therapy facility dedicated entirely to neurodivergent Black children in the greater Atlanta area. I wanted to create a safe, nurturing environment where kids exactly like Maya could discover their own powerful voices through creativity and artistic expression without ever feeling like they were a burden to society. We poured millions of dollars from the foundation we established into the construction project, ensuring the building had the absolute best therapists, the highest quality art supplies, and completely free access for working-class families who could not normally afford such specialized care. We took the very soil that was meant to be a monument to a greedy, arrogant man's fragile ego, and we completely transformed it into a sanctuary of healing and hope for an entire struggling community. Marcus wanted to use my daughter to build an empire of selfish greed, and instead we used his ruins to build an empire of radical transformative love. The towering windows of my new sleek director's office overlooked the very spot where a ruined, shattered man had once tried to destroy my entire existence. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, running my fingers over the smooth, cool wood. The sun was setting over the city of Atlanta, casting a long, warm, golden light across the floor. I looked down at the framed photograph sitting perfectly in the center of my desk. It was a picture of Maya standing proudly next to her multi-million-dollar installation at the New York Gallery, her face completely radiant with genuine, unfiltered joy. I traced the edge of the silver frame with my thumb, letting the profound weight of our incredible journey wash over me completely. 11 years ago, I was a terrified, desperate woman drowning in a massive, suffocating ocean of medical debt and eviction notices. I was a wife who had been brutally, casually discarded by a man who thought I was nothing more than temporary collateral damage. But they had all made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They looked at a struggling stepmother and a nonverbal autistic child, and they saw easy prey. They saw a vulnerable target that they could manipulate, isolate, and destroy without ever facing a single consequence. They believed that because we lived in the quiet shadows, because we did not scream or demand attention, that we were fundamentally inherently weak. They genuinely thought that my silence was a symptom of my surrender. But they did not know that when you back a desperate mother into a dark, inescapable corner, she does not just sit down and cry. She does not wait for a hero to come and save her. She becomes the hero. She spends her sleepless nights learning the complex, ruthless intricacies of corporate law. She builds an untouchable, impenetrable empire in the absolute shadows. She meticulously studies the exact, greedy, predictable nature of the predators who are hunting her. And when the timing is absolutely perfect, she does not just fight back. She completely systematically flips your entire chessboard and forces you to choke on your own insatiable arrogance. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, closing my eyes and listening to the soft, distant sounds of children laughing in the therapy rooms down the hall. The community center we had built on the very ashes of Marcus's foreclosed property was thriving beautifully. We were providing free top-tier art therapy to dozens of neurodivergent Black children, ensuring that no mother in this city ever had to feel the crushing, desperate panic that I had felt 11 years ago. We had taken a site of pure toxic greed and transformed it into a monument of radical, profound healing. I opened my eyes and looked directly toward the camera, knowing that there were countless other women out there silently fighting their own grueling, invisible battles against people who called themselves family. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, my voice calm, steady, and carrying the absolute unbreakable authority of a woman who had walked through hell and returned holding the keys to the kingdom. Have you ever had to deal with incredibly greedy, toxic people hiding behind the sacred word family? Have you ever watched the people who should have protected you try to tear you down the exact moment they realized you had something of value? Remember this, my friends. The absolute best, sweetest revenge is never found in screaming, arguing, or begging them to understand your pain. The best revenge is executing perfect silent preparation. It is stepping back out of their way and letting their own bottomless, blinding greed dig their permanent graves. It is building a life so incredibly successful and profoundly beautiful that their toxic, pathetic existence becomes completely irrelevant to your future. If you have ever had to fight back against the people who deeply underestimated your worth, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below and share how you took your power back from the people who tried to steal it. Your story might be the exact spark of hope that someone else desperately needs to hear today. And please do not forget to hit that subscribe button for more journeys of reclaiming unyielding power and demanding absolute irreversible justice. Thank you for walking this incredible journey with me. Remember, you are always stronger than the shadows they try to cast over you. Keep building your empire in the quiet and let them absolutely choke when you finally step in.